way this is a medium.
To trace the development of the first confederations in Canada, we can start where the history of modern Canada itself began. Here in Quebec City, the oldest permanent European settlement in the country. Like many other Canadian cities, Quebec is built on the site of an Indian village. The particular village which is buried beneath these streets used to be called Stadacona. When the first Europeans arrived here in the 1530s, Stadacona looked something like this: a cluster of longhouses, which were home to about 500 people. There were similar longhouse villages strung out along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. The most important one to the west was Hochelaga. This is where Montreal now stands. Hochelaga had a population of about 1,500 people. Surrounding Lake Ontario, there were still more longhouse villages, some of them with as many as 3,000 inhabitants. All of these longhouse settlements belonged to the Iroquoian-speaking peoples of the eastern woodlands, who may have numbered about 125,000 when the Europeans first came to Canada. The Iroquoians were distinguished from their other Canadian neighbors, such as the Algonquians, by their longhouses and their much heavier concentrations of population. But there were other differences. They had a very elaborate political organization. For hundreds of years, the Iroquoians had been split up into a number of different tribes or nations. During the 1400s, friction between these tribes led to more and more blood feuds. So, several groups of tribes banded together into confederacies to try to cut down the fighting, as well as for self-protection. According to Iroquois legend, the most powerful of these confederations was formed by a Huron by the name of Deconawida, whose spokesman Hiawatha has since become familiar to us through the poems of Longfellow. Hiawatha united 5 Iroquoian tribes: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk into the League of the Iroquois, or the League of 5 Nations. To the north of Lake Ontario, another Iroquoian confederation was formed, also during the 1400s. This was the Huron Confederacy, which consisted of 4 or 5 different Huron tribes. Both the Huron Confederacy and the Iroquois League functioned as participatory democracies. They had constitutions and a system of tribal representation based on their peace chiefs, or sachems. These sachems were all members of a governing council, which met frequently to debate intertribal affairs. But in spite of their success in keeping the peace within their own tribal groups, these confederations only made the bloodshed worse when they turned against each other, as they were to do time and again in the 15 and 1600s. Many of these battles were to be bound up with the struggle between the French and the English for the control of North America. In fact, the Iroquois League of 5 Nations, which later became the League of 6 Nations, was to play a leading role in Canadian history right up into the early 1800s. For some 400 years before our present Canadian Confederation began to take shape in 1867, many of the affairs of this country were determined by the Iroquoian confederations. The economic roots of the sophistication of the Iroquoian and other native societies go back over thousands of years and over thousands of kilometers south of Canada to here, the Tehuacan Valley in southern Mexico. It is here that some 7,000 years ago, a revolution began, which was to have an enormous impact on the first peoples of the Americas. But to begin with, this wasn't a revolution in politics. It was a revolution in food. In the 1960s, archaeologists began to dig up, quite literally, the seeds of this revolution here at Tehuacan. These caves represent the oldest continuously occupied human settlement anywhere in the Americas.
This used to be the floor of the cave right here, the level ground, at the top of the earth. And on top of this floor, we found scraping planes, big scrapers, grinding stones, some foodstuffs, mostly wild and so forth. And this is a layer, which we call Zone R, or Layer R, which is characteristic of one of our earliest cultures in this cave, which we call El Riego, named after the oasis area up there. Now, after these people left here, wind blew in, rocks fell down from the top of the cave, and all this earth here piled up. Then, 1,000 years later, somebody else came back in here.
There are traces here of 28 levels of human occupancy, showing what people used to eat over a period of 11,000 years. At the earliest level, about 9,000 BC, all the evidence is of wild plants. But between the 8,000 and 7,000 BC levels, we find the remains of the first domesticated plants in all of the Americas. Chili peppers, bottle gourds, and various types of squash, including the pumpkin. And most important of all, when we get to the 5,000 BC level, we find tiny cobs of maize, or what came to be called Indian corn. Between 5,000 and 3,000 BC, we start to find larger and larger corn cobs. From now on, domesticated corn was to provide an ever greater proportion of the diet of the Mexican Indians. Also, by about 3,000 BC, beans started to be cultivated in Central America. By 2000 BC, these and other domesticated plants had replaced hunting and gathering as the chief source of food in many parts of Mexico. This is really where the agricultural revolution begins, because agriculture changes everything. First of all, it means that you have a regular, reliable, and much more abundant supply of food. This leads to a population explosion, and this population is now concentrated in one place, because people no longer have to go wandering off in search of food. It can all be produced right where they live. This combination of more food, more people, and a more settled way of life means that it's no longer necessary for everyone to worry where their next meal is coming from. They can turn to other things. People start to specialize in pottery, weaving, building more elaborate houses. This leads to society itself becoming more elaborate, with hierarchies of chiefs and priests and warriors. All this ultimately sprang from agriculture, which had its first beginnings in Mexico in about 7,000 BC. By 5,000 BC, agriculture was also being practiced in South America. By 1,000 BC, agriculture had spread to parts of North America. And finally, by 500 AD, the cultivation of plants had reached the Iroquoians. Wherever agriculture went, many of the changes that go with it transformed people's lives. And this included much more involved political arrangements, such as the Iroquoian confederations.
We now return to Origins on History Television.
These figurines were made about 3,000 years ago. These giant stone heads also date back some 3,000 years. They were carved in honor of the rulers of the Olmecs, the first of the great classical civilizations which once flourished in what is known as Middle America, or Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica corresponded roughly with where central and southern Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize are today. It also overlapped into Honduras and El Salvador. The stimulus for the flowering of the Olmec and other Mesoamerican civilizations was the adoption of agriculture. For agriculture not only meant more food and more people and more social complexity, it also made possible the development of the arts and sciences and the construction of monumental buildings and cities. This is Teotihuacan, which was the capital city of one of the cultures which succeeded the Olmecs. At its peak, in about 300 AD, Teotihuacan had a population of over 250,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Much of this spectacular construction was linked with religion and the glorification of the godlike rulers of these peoples. This was especially true of the Mayas, who reached the pinnacle of their power in Mesoamerica in about 700 AD. All sorts of different religious cults sprang up in Mesoamerica, some of them involving human sacrifice, as in the case of the Aztecs, who came to power in the 1400s. In South America, the development of agriculture also led to the rise of advanced civilizations, culminating in the empire of the Incas, which extended over a vast region, covering most of what is now Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. Like the Aztecs, the Incas also reached their peak in the 1400s. The Incas are remembered above all for their magnificent mountain city, Machu Picchu, and their enormous network of roads and bridges which stretched almost the entire length of South America. The Mayas and the Aztecs and the Incas have often been described as the Greeks and Romans of the Americas. Just as the cultural energy of Europe once flowed from Greece and Rome, so did many of the ideas and innovations of the first peoples of the Americas once flow from Mexico and Peru. One of the most important means by which goods and ideas circulated in pre-European Canada and America was trade. For thousands of years before the coming of the Europeans, the native peoples had traded with one another. But in many parts of the Americas, goods were not transported by land, but by water, thanks to the huge network of lakes and rivers that spanned so much of this continent. From the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence, the Ohio, and the Mississippi. In this way, native groups had access to many of the different goods and materials that were available in the Americas. Within Canada, 3 of the main trade items were copper from the Great Lakes region, shell ornaments from the East Coast, and obsidian from the Rockies, and extremely hard volcanic glass used for making spear points and knives. It is through this trade network that agriculture managed to travel all the way from Mesoamerica right up to the Iroquoian peoples in southern Canada. But the Iroquoians had no direct contact with any of the peoples of Mexico or Peru. The influence of these cultures only reached Canada via a number of intermediary civilizations. Sometime before 1000 BC, agriculture started to spread north from the Mexican Indians to their nearest neighbors in the southwestern part of what is now the United States. This eventually resulted in the blossoming of the great Pueblo civilizations. Pueblo is Spanish for village, but the settlements of these peoples went way beyond simple villages, as we see in such elaborate housing developments as this one in New Mexico, which is called Pueblo Bonito. In Colorado, we find the ruins of another extraordinary achievement of the Pueblo peoples, the Cliff Palace of Mesa Verde. Towards the end of the 1300s, many of these large pueblos were abandoned, apparently because of an exceptionally severe drought which ruined the surrounding farmland. But by this time, the Mesoamerican influence had also spread to the eastern half of North America, where by about 1000 BC, some Mesoamerican foods were starting to be grown, as well as local crops such as the sunflower. Sometime around 500 AD, corn became more important in eastern North America, and the peoples of the Mississippi Valley began to build huge temple mounds, which had obviously been influenced by similar monuments in Mesoamerica. And at the same time, around 500 AD, corn began to reach the Iroquoians. Thus was completed the chain of cause and effect, which led from the discovery of agriculture in southern Mexico to the Iroquoian confederacies of southern Canada.
We now return to Origins on History Television.
In the 1300s, a plague swept across Europe of such epic proportions it became known as the Black Death. Nearly a third of the entire population of Europe died. This terrible disaster was a foreshadowing of the even more catastrophic decline in the native population of the Americas, which was to take place a couple of centuries later. The Black Death was the worst plague ever recorded in the Old World. But we know that for thousands of years, Europe, Africa, and Asia had periodically been ravaged by other, almost equally devastating waves of infection, ranging from smallpox and measles to influenza, typhus, and cholera. But in the Americas, these diseases were quite unknown. Before the Europeans arrived, there were no widespread epidemics on this continent. The reason for this boils down to geography. And it takes us back once more to how the native peoples got here in the first place. They all originally entered the New World via Siberia and Alaska, via the Arctic, in other words, one of the coldest regions on Earth. So cold, in fact, that it represented a sort of immense antiseptic shield, protecting the New World from all of the Old World bacteria and viruses. No one suffering from these diseases could ever have survived the long journey through this frigid terrain. The only way these viruses could have reached the Americas was via the warmer ocean routes much further south. But it was to be thousands of years before man was equipped to cross these oceans. So for most of their history, the native populations of this continent were insulated from many of the deadly microbes that plagued the rest of mankind. This was a very happy state of affairs, but it also had its negative side. it meant that they were never able to build up any immunity to these infections. So that when the Europeans did eventually develop the equipment and the know-how for crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the native peoples had no means of combating the veritable deluge of disease the Europeans unwittingly unleashed upon them. The viruses of smallpox and measles and influenza and bubonic plague had a field day. None of the considerable medicinal skills of the native peoples had prepared them for this. When the first wave of Europeans began to explore the Americas in earnest in the early 1500s, there were perhaps 1 million native peoples living in what is now Canada. A further 5 to 10 million in the future United States, and an astonishing 40 to 70 million people in Mexico and the rest of Central and South America. In fact, the total population of the Americas at this time was actually greater than the population of Europe. England, for example, only had about 3 million inhabitants at the beginning of the 1500s. But by the time the second wave of Europeans arrived in North America in the early 1600s, the population in many areas had shrunk by as much as 90%. Tens of millions of the native peoples had been wiped out. A form of unintentional genocide had taken place that was nearly 3 times as lethal as the Black Death. Europe eventually recovered from the Black Death, but the native peoples never recovered, because the havoc wrought by the great plagues in the Americas was compounded by the many other radical changes that were to take place after the arrival of the Europeans. If the Mayas and the Mississippians, the Aztecs and the Iroquoians have in a sense become the lost civilizations of the Americas, this was brought about by both men and microbes.